بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Wanted to start by thanking the administration and Imam Ahmed of ICGT. I think that's all the letters. Now, Muslim institutions always have long acronyms. You know, we have, I think almost every masjid in our area, at least 5 letters. And so people come there and they're like, is it ICNVT, ICNV, NOVT? There's a lot of them. So, inshallah, I think I got it there. So, again, Jazakallah khair, and for the gracious introduction, which was not deserved and a little exaggeration. But inshallah, there's khair in what we will be discussing today. So, I figure what I'd do is I would foreground our conversation that we're going to have, and then maybe we can just open it up and have a little bit of a dialogue with the audience to talk about some of the issues that I'll be broaching. In large part, a lot of the issues that I'll be talking about, I think at least, are probably not going to be strange or foreign to most people in the room. A lot of these are issues that we witness, that we see, and that many of us perhaps experience in our own lives and with our families. And the hope today is to help to try to diagnose some of those problems and why they are taking place. And the type of contention that I'm going to offer today is that these problems are situated at its center on the disillusioned and slow deterioration of family life in the West. And the family life is an institution that sits at the heart, is a fundamental institution that crafts societies and civic life more broadly. And this is something that is an ethic that is anchored very deeply in the Quran and Sunnah. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit more. I wanted to provide some context for it before I begin. And this context is a bit of a historical overview, and I won't spend a lot of time on it. But I will say that many of these trends have been a long time coming. Even though they've really accelerated, I'd say in the last decade and a half to 2 decades, the wheels were set in motion long ago. They were set in motion by philosophers, political theorists, and others that advanced a altogether new paradigm of how societies were to be constructed. And those societies were going to be predicated and foregrounded on the notion of individualism. And although all societies have some notion of individual rights, this new world, this new ideal was going to be one in which the individual loomed over all other obligations. Some of this was done with legitimate and justified cause, because it was done in response to moments of tyranny and authoritarianism. You guys are familiar with people like Karl Popper and others. They're all writing after World War II, right? The open society and its enemies, things like that. But what we have today in modern society is a society that has taken a lot of those motifs and pushed them into overdrive, such that the individual in modern society stands above all else. And the idea that an individual is connected and committed to others in ways that binds them and obligates them to do things at times that are undesirable to them becomes something that is patently offensive to more and more people. And we witness this in the way people begin to talk, right? The sort of aversion to judgmentalism, right? The sort of how dare you culture, right? The idea that someone can try to tell me that I'm doing something wrong. This can be incredibly difficult in the context of masjids and religious instruction. Because part of the goal of religion is to develop a relationship with God and to bring a person into conversation and closer proximity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that oftentimes grates against a person's nafs, and comes against a person's soul and spirit, and tells them the things that they're doing have to be morally upright. And where they're failing, it highlights those failures. And so as an institutional project, religion has a difficult time in an environment where people are quick to anger when they are looked at as being in the wrong, and literally find the very notion that they could possibly be in the wrong objectionable. Family life itself in the West has been taking a decline for some time. Almost all statistics bear it out. And there are a couple of good books if you're interested on this. I'd say a good accessible book that was written recently, it's a very recent work, is by an author named Mary Eberstadt. The book's called Primal Screams. And she draws on a lot of literature. Robert Putnam, he has Bowling Alone. That was written about 15 to 20 years ago. But the statistics literally bear it out. we're living in a moment where fewer and fewer people are having children. So if you look at fertility rates now in the United States, we're at a 32-year low. Across the West, most European countries, you're no longer at replacement levels. You have certain countries like Japan. They say in Japan now there are about 4,000 people that die a week alone. And they have entire organizations and institutions that have been set up to help clean up. They're basically cleanup crews for decayed bodies. And those bodies will be discovered through stench and things like that. These are people who have no external connections at all. And the New York Times had done an expose on that phenomenon. And so if you're interested in that, you can check that out. But this is something that's increasing, and it's increasing in Muslim societies too, where the idea of a large family unit is something that is in decline. And fewer people are entering into relationships in which they have large families. So you have more families where if they're married, they only have one child or no child at all. So now you have fewer people that have siblings, you have fewer people that have large extended families, and very much you find yourself as an individual and alone in the world. In addition to that, you have fewer marriages that are taking place. And the marriage age continues to rise. So when people do marry, they marry very late in life. And that has its own set of issues and problems. Because what begins to happen is that people aren't situated, they're not settled in their lives. They're not committed in any way to anything other than themselves. And so they become very narcissistic individuals. People become very, very intensely self-absorbed. They're always concerned about themselves. They're looking out for themselves. They're just doing themselves and no one else. And so even the concept of thinking beyond a person becomes very strange. And you'll find, in fact, in the life of the Prophet ﷺ and in his instruction, in even small things, the idea that a person should be involved in a greater group. You see this, for instance, when the Prophet ﷺ talks about eating. Right? طَعَامُ الْإِثْنَيْنِ كَافِ الثَّلَاثَةِ. Right? 2 people's food is good enough for 3. وَطَعَامُ الثَّلَاثَةِ كَافِ الْأَرْبَعِ. Right? 3 people's food, good enough for 4. So the idea is bring more people into your meals. أَحَبُّ الطَّعَامِ إِلَى اللَّهِ. That the most beloved food to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, مَا كَثُرَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ أَيْدِي. أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام, where he said the one that has the most hands over it, the plate. The most beloved food to Allah is the one that has the most hands over it. There's a hadith, Abu Qatada al-Khushani, radiyallahu anh, where Abu Tha'lab al-Khushani, and so he said that we were traveling with the Prophet ﷺ, and he said we came to a place to rest. And when we came to that place to rest, to sit down, he said we all went our separate ways and we sat separately. And he said that the Prophet ﷺ told us that you did not separate like that except because of shaitan. And so he said after that, when we would travel and sit, we would be so close to one another that if someone threw a blanket, it could cover all of us. That's how close we would stay to one another. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, there's no 3 people, there's no 3 of you in a valley, in a desert, anywhere, that does not establish the prayer. إِلَّا اسْتَحْوَذَ عَلَيْهِمْ الشَّيْطَانِ. Except that shaitan has overtaken you. فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِالْجَمَاعَةِ. Because upon you is the community, the group. And he said, for indeed the wolf, فَإِنَّمَا يَأْكُلُ الذِّئْبُ الْغَنَمِ الْقَاسِيَةِ. That indeed the wolf eats the stray sheep that finds itself alone and in isolation. So you find this type of instruction replete throughout the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And in fact, this existed after the life of the Prophet ﷺ as well. One of the things that I find very interesting in the hadith tradition is if you look at, there's a category of evaluation where you look at people who narrate reports, and there are certain things that they might find about a person who might be looked at as reliable, but they do things that are just judged as undignified or questionable. Kharam al-muru'ah. And one of the things that actually falls into there at times is a person who that people see him eating alone. That he was witness and he would just be sitting and eating alone. And that's actually seen as a concerning observation on a person. that he's not eating with others? What does that say about that person as an individual and their own reliability? And there's an interesting book, I was reading through it recently, it's called In Defense of Food, Michael Pollan. And he talks about modern food culture, and one of the things he actually spends a fair amount of time on is the encouragement for isolated eating. People are eating in their cars, they're eating alone, right? Even families that are eating together, everybody's kind of eating alone even though they're in the same place. People are watching TV, there's no real interaction. And how that can breed very unhealthy eating habits because of the type of culture that's being cultivated as part of that. You're right next to each other, but you're really completely disconnected and detached. And that's what the modern world has done. If you look at apartments, for instance, they say apartments are very appropriate words because even though we're right next to one another, we're always apart. Everyone's apart from the next person. And so this type of detachment happens in very, very severe ways. We also see this in the rise in single-family or single-parent households. Not single-parent households through, the typical circumstances, where marriage with divorce or, a widow or someone's spouse passes away. But a situation or circumstance where from the beginning the design is to not get into a relationship or a family, where it's not going to be a two-spouse household from the beginning. In some European societies, IVF, in vitro fertilization, where people artificially consume, or conceive, rather. In Denmark now, it's at 10%. 10% of all pregnancies occur that way, where women simply walk into clinics and they get pregnant and they leave, and they conceive on their own. And that type of lifestyle is responding to something. It's responding to a type of loneliness that a lot of people are feeling. And, there's some interesting articles that have been written recently on the rise in dog culture. How more and more major cities are just being organized around pets and dogs because people don't have children anymore. And so fewer people are making use of child facilities and they're making more use of dog facilities. So there's dog parks, restaurants offering dog food and things like that. They need to be dog friendly because, the types of things that they had for children where, hey, I could bring my stroller and no one's using those things anymore. And so those facilities are less necessary. And again, this has an impact on the type of people we end up being. Children teach us something about ourselves, and they teach us a lot about how to live. Parenting teaches us a lot. Parenting teaches a lot in life, the type of relationships that get established. These are the people that mediate our existence in the world. They are our first guidelines when it comes to understanding morality and ethics, creating virtuous human beings. People who are ethically comported towards one another. This is what parenthood is organized around. That sort of nurturing context that helps people. But we're seeing an increase in very fractured households. And it's not just, people always, parent-child conflicts, those always happen. That's not a new thing, right? I mean, I was a kid, everybody's like, my parents, they don't know what they're talking about, right? Like, every kid thinks that. Basically, if you don't think that, mashallah, like that's a great household, right? But that's rare, right? But most kids think that. But what's new is the extent to which parents have absolutely no clue how their children are living. It is a complete black box to many of them, the actual life that their children have. And it's because so much of their life takes place online now. And that online form is completely invisible to them. And so what my child is up to, who he's friends with, what their opinions are things that they're not in direct conversation with or even familiar with, despite the fact that you're living under the same roof. And increasingly, for many children, the idea of parents is seen as parents are treated in very antagonistic ways, because these are individuals that you didn't choose. And it is the fact that I didn't get to choose them that grates against their individualistic notions. So why should I give them more respect than my friends who I did choose? And so more and more we see depicted the emancipated individual, right? Sort of the free youth, the one who doesn't have to deal with the demands of parents. It doesn't have to deal with the nagging of their siblings and others. I see this often more and more on campuses now, where you have students that will go literally months without calling their parents. And it's not so much that they don't call, people forget, but the thought of calling doesn't enter their mind. It's not even something that incites a level of guilt. And I see families where parents want to go and visit their children. They're looking for weekends, and their kids keep pushing them off. They're saying, look, I don't want to do it. We also see this with fewer people getting married, where parents can't even talk to their children about this, and fewer people they just get annoyed at the discussion. The idea is, I just want to continue being free, independent, enjoying my life, extended adolescence. It's all about satisfying my lowly desires. Wealth, entertainment, partying, having fun. This becomes the leitmotif of the modern world. And it is a type of setting that's very incompatible and unsuitable for a robust and healthy family life, because family conditions us to live for more than ourselves. People who have children know how much of their lives is devoted to doing things that they don't necessarily want to do for themselves. And if they had to do it, they wouldn't choose these things. But they're doing it because they think it's good for their kids. And they think it's good for their family. And the amount of sacrifices they'll make week after week are specifically ordered towards helping that outcome. But that is not something that is necessarily represented. Imam Ahmad spoke about this in the introduction. We see this also in media representations of families. You know, in the 90s, it was not uncommon to see family sitcoms that had positive family depictions. It was not uncommon. You know, if you consider common family sitcoms, Family Matters, Full House, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, what else is there?
Father Knows Best.
Yeah, I mean, you had shows that had good male figures, right, and good father figures that were role models. They stepped in, they asserted themselves. They were respectful people, even if they had quirks. They had quirks, they were funny, and sometimes they were the butt of jokes. But at the same time, they were fundamentally respectful human beings. And they were people that the family would turn to in difficult moments and circumstances. And the household was a common theme. The integrity of the household, the caring for one another was a common theme in these shows. And these weren't necessarily Islamic shows by any stretch of the imagination, right? They had their problems, whatever. But at the same time, that was still a common ethic that society was galvanizing around. And today, that is not how sitcoms and television and media is represented. Very rarely do you see television and other forms of media that actually depicts a family at all. And that's because more and more entertainment has moved towards streaming. So people are on Netflix, now Disney Plus and things like that. I can choose TV shows, and a lot of times the TV shows are ordered around an independent individual who is not obligated. And so you see Netflix, they have a lot of Marvel shows where it's just a person who's living independently, saving the world, making money, doing whatever. And they're the hero. But you're seeing fewer and fewer people who actually are in a family setting. And the idea that any of these people have a family is just sort of, a sideshow, if it even exists at all. So these increasingly, you're seeing a lot of situations where you don't actually see a family at all. And when you do see a family, you see a very dysfunctional family. You see the type of family where a father is a buffoon, an absolute buffoon. He's drinking beer all the time. He's on the couch. He's a useless human being. He's a liability in the household. People make fun of him incessantly. That's the type of depiction that you get of fathers frequently on television. And so the type of positive masculinity, positive representations of manhood, don't actually represent themselves or find themselves here. And the types of things that men would do normally, the types of camaraderie, bonding, the places where positive representations of manhood would grow, happen far less. So what you have now are more men than ever before that are addicted to narcotics. The overwhelming users of narcotics are men. You look at this statistically with opiate addictions. Overwhelmingly, it's a male practice. Likewise with marijuana and everything else. And opiates are especially concerning because this is a drug that escapes you from the world. It is an escape mechanism. It is something that gets you to leave your circumstances entirely. It dulls you to the life that you should be living. And it puts you in a place that's completely alien to anything else. Yeah, they talk about fentanyl, which is, I think, perhaps the most common opiate. Say it's grains, right? It's like grains of salt. Say 7 grains is what gets you the kick, and 9 will kill you. I mean, that's the margins that people are working on today, and it's a public health crisis. It's a public health crisis that we have on our hands. You have more and more men now that are incarcerated. Overwhelming number of people, vast majority, predominant number of people that enter prisons, men. You have fewer men that are graduating from college, fewer men that are employed. You have a much greater acute range of depressions. I mean, this is serious, very serious. And likewise, we're seeing these types of declines in women. And they're studied about their own psychological and mental health. And they talk about their own subjective happiness. And they talk about their own loneliness. You actually have emerging in many university institutions today entire divisions around loneliness studies. Loneliness studies. And in a setting which has so radically reordered the notion of family and prioritized the individual, it is very difficult to be a good Muslim. Very difficult to be a good Muslim in this setting. Because Islam is not about praising the individual to a point where a person is just being constantly affirmed, but it is about taking a person to submit themselves to Allah, to a higher power, to transcend themselves and to transcend those base and lowly needs. You know, the Prophet ﷺ in the Quran, is honored. The highest honorific that occurs in the Prophet ﷺ's life in the Quran is when the Prophet ﷺ is referred to by abd, by slave. Surah Al-Isra, Subhana alladhi asra bi'abdihi. Bi'abdihi. That all praise, or how perfect, magnified, is the one who sent his abd, his slave, on the ascension and the journey of Isra wal Mi'raj. Alhamdulillah alladhi anzala ala abdihi al-kitab. That all praise due to the one who sent and revealed to his abd, his slave, the book. That is a praiseworthy station for the Prophet ﷺ. And it's the type of thing, ubudiyah, that Muslims strive towards. And it requires a profound sense of humility and a recognition of things that extend far above and beyond our individual needs. In fact, it's something that requires us, in many, many instances, to resist temptation and to resist the things that we want to do in order to improve ourselves and to cultivate our spirit and our heart. This is also difficult because faith is bound up in family. In the Quran, we see this time and again where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about His oneness with being good to parents. وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. This comes time and again, that your Lord has decreed that you worship none but Him, and that you're good to your parents. Silat al-Rahim, talking about maintaining the ties of kinship. One of the very scary and concerning phenomena that's grown is one that I've witnessed personally with young Muslims who aren't just not in touch with relatives, they don't even know their names. We run into more Muslim youth who don't know their uncles, they don't know their aunts, they don't know their names. They know loosely and vaguely that they have some. So you talk about families that are distant but not even in touch at all. And so people who are being raised in strong extended families, who have connections with those people, are becoming more rare. So this is something that we're feeling more and more in the Muslim community. And that's a challenge in the Prophet ﷺ, the Silat al-Rahim, the maintaining the ties of kinship through the interconnectedness of blood bonds, is something that is at the heart of Muslim societies. It is at the heart of Muslim living. The tending towards the elderly. Right? Modern society has provided a mechanism through which we are not living alongside our elderly in any effective way. Vast majority of our elderly are sequestered in homes that are specifically designed for them. so that other people don't have to tend to them. And so fewer children are raised around grandparents and other elderly figures. They don't see them as much. And this, again, has an impact on people. It has an impact. You lose the wisdom of your elderly. You lose the type of patience that you have to have. When people get older, it can be difficult. It can be difficult. You know, especially grandparents and other, when they get very old and they begin to slow down. You know, sometimes they can almost become more like children in their thinking and the type of help that they need. But that type of morality, the ethic, the virtue that gets established and built as a family around tending to that and caring to that ends up being lost. This can also be one of the reasons why fewer and fewer people want to deal with masjids, especially young people, who come to the community and end up interacting with people that they simply find disagreeable. They come to a masjid and they find people there and they say, you know what, I don't want to have to deal with these people. Because throughout the rest of their life, they've grown accustomed to living a very catered existence, an existence that is catered to their needs and doesn't put them in even rare moments of discomfort. So all of these things are collapsing in some ways. And they're coming together at a particular moment that has made it extremely difficult for many of us and our families. And this is something as Muslims that we have to be concerned about and work against. And there's a lot that could be said about the things that we can do, but I would say that at a minimum, you should think about the things that I'm saying and just think about the opposite, right? So the idea that we are a community that wants to care for our elderly, and we're families that want to care for them. That we are the type of people that want to establish families that maintain strong ties of kinship, including extended relatives and others that live far from us. That we want our children to know them, and we want our children to grow up around them. That we want to have children, we want to have them to have siblings, and we want to have robust and healthy families. We want to encourage an ethic of marriage and commitment and moral accountability. But we want to do all of those things, right? We want to do all of those things. So, you know, my daughter usually tells me my talks are boring. So, I'll tell her that she seemed to enjoy it. So again, there's a lot that could be said here. I've given some references in the course of the talk, so if you're interested, you can certainly read those books. There's a tremendous amount of material here. And there's a lot more that I could say, literally, politically, and the way these issues intersect the insanity of our politics, the way these things intersect campus climate and what's happening on campuses. Again, it's not a monocausal factor. There are other factors as well. But for Muslims, family has to be one of our utmost concerns. And I think especially at this moment as Muslims, this is something that we should make a serious effort to galvanize around. And so with that said, I guess I don't know what time it is, or I didn't, that clock wasn't working. So I was looking at it at a time and I was like, it's just 2:14 from the time I started to the time I ended here. So. No? Hadith. So Shaykh, he was mentioning the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, خيركم خيركم لأهلي وأنا خير لأهلي. No. Oh, hadith الذي يخالط الناس. So the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said that the person who mixes with the people, الذي يخالط الناس يصبر على أذاهم, and he's patient with their harms. أعظم أجرا, that he has more reward. وخير من من لا يخالط الناس ولا يصبر على أذاهم. أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام, that he's better than the one, and it's more meritorious a person than the one who does not mix with the people and is not patient with their harms. And then I thought he was mentioning the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said the best of you are the ones who are best to their family. خيركم خيركم لأهلي وأنا خير لأهلي. And the Prophet ﷺ said that I'm the best to my family. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
You can have your seat, Sidi. Can we give Imam Mobeen a round of applause? So just to prepare you, we are going to go over 1:30 today. I humbly ask that if that's too long for you, please be considerate about the sound. It's an important conversation, and I want to give all of you an opportunity to ask your questions. So we're also going to try something new, inshallah, because you know me, I like new things. I want you to take out your phone, if you have it with you. LOL, all of you have it with you, of course. I want you to jot down this number, 567 246 2129. Now that it's on live stream, I'm gonna get like spammed by a whole bunch of random insurance companies or something.
Say it again.
567 246 2129. Okay? If you have a question, text it to this number. And that way, I can, inshallah, group these questions, and then, that way we can have more time for the conversation. So again, I'm going to repeat the number one last time. It's 567-246-2129, inshallah. If you have questions, text it to that number. Okay. Bismillah. Again, can we give Imam Mobeen a round of applause? That was so beautiful. So, inshallah, I'll be watching out for your questions. Imam Mobeen, one of the things that, we talk about these statistics that are very troubling, and kind of the trends and the movement towards a society that obviously does not accommodate an essential foundational principle of family. One thing that I wanted to ask though is that there's also, like, on the flip side, there are many people, family begins with marriage, right? There are many people that will tell you, well, it's not that I don't want to get married, it's not that I want to be alone, it's that I can't find any good men. And vice versa. You'll have men saying the same thing. I can't find a good spouse, and so I'm not choosing to be this way. And so there are these kind of specific circumstances that, if it's okay, can you comment on this?
Yeah, I guess I can try. You can call me Mobeen. So I'd prefer that home. So, and anyway, on the marriage thing, this could be like, I guess, a retreat or something, right? Because Muslims, everybody's talking about marriage all the time. There's a lot that's been written on that. So there are a lot of factors that contribute to the decline in marriage. Some of them are pretty observable, but you can mention them, but they're not easy to overcome. So there are economic factors, for instance, that contribute to marriage. You have individuals who, all of them have their own career aspirations and goals, and although a person wants to get married, they're not willing to compromise that. And that'll be a mutual ambition, right? Someone wants to be a partner in a law firm, the other person wants to be CTO of a company and all that. I mean, everybody's got something that they want to pursue, and marriage invariably will require some sort of compromising of that pursuit. And so a lot of times people will say, well, I'll wait till I achieve this particular accolade, or I cross this line in my life, and then I'll think more seriously about marriage. Usually by that point, it becomes far more difficult to get married. Partly because now the pool is more narrow, you're dealing with people who have been divorced in other situations, but also because by that point you've grown accustomed to living alone. And so the push for marriage actually ends up declining more and more. And that can also happen around the same time at which, specifically for women, your biological clock's coming to a close. And so now the prospect of even having children is coming to a close. And so now the idea of just getting married is it's very, very much an optional activity, because you've grown accustomed to sort of having your own life. The only thing that may drive it is simply the sense of, I don't want to die alone, right? That'll be the motivation. But that sort of solitary life is one that people can grow accustomed to living in some ways. And so that does become a challenge, where you have the economic factors. You also have moral factors, and that is a real problem that we have to be honest about today. That we live in a climate which is largely unprecedented in its open hedonism. When you talk about pornography and statistics on pornography and the proliferation of it, there is no precedent that can compare to this. And when people are saturated in a hypersexualized climate, the idea of seeing in one another mutual dignity and respect becomes far more difficult. By default, you grow up thinking of yourself and of others basically sexual objects. And that ends up taking an outsized place in relationships. And so if you think about cohabitation, for instance, which is the phenomenon of just a woman and a man just living together in an unmarried capacity, those relationships are completely ordered around erogenous activities, which is their individual and relative sexual interest. And, that's basically it. There really is no deeper shared commitment in those relationships. And that's why cohabiting households far more likely to have abuse and domestic violence. Cohabitation, when it ends up in marriage, is one of the leading causes and factors for divorce. So those aren't sustainable relationships. But that's what ends up happening. And so there's a good book on this by Mark Reginaris called Cheap Sex that I tend to encourage. It's very good work that takes a strong analysis at just what he refers to as the sexual economy. But that can serve as an impediment to this. And I mentioned pornography, but again, that's a loose term, because I'm not just talking about sort of the most hedonistic activity, but just even your day-to-day television. I spoke about the fact that more and more people now, their daily television and entertainment needs are satisfied on streaming media. Streaming media are not regulated. They're not regulated. And there's a lot more latitude that they have when it comes to dipping into things that are generally illicit or regulated by the federal government through other communication means. And so you can have a lot more profanity in those shows. You can have a lot more hypersexualized content in those shows. So you have shows like Game of Thrones, for instance, which is very, very popular, right? I mean, a lot of people watch Game of Thrones. And Game of Thrones, I've read about it, but it depicts, unprecedented levels of sexuality. Unprecedented. They've broken records as a TV program. And so, your sort of typical program and show that a lot of people are watching are saturated in that type of material. And so that becomes a very, very big obstacle for individuals who are being raised in the middle of this climate to actually see marriage as something that's desirable. Because now you're talking about a commitment towards an individual that is, although there's sort of the sort of romantic component to it, it is far more than that. It is far more than that. And anybody that's in a family recognizes how much more of that is. And in fact, the type of affection and love that develops in a long-term family relationship is very different than just the sort of hedonistic, lowly sexual activities that one might see on TV, right? That's not what sustains a household. It's not what sustains a marriage. And certainly not a family. And usually those alternate forms of affection, the mutual commitment, the care, the concern, that's something that is felt in an unspoken capacity by the spouses and by everyone involved in it. There's a type of warmth in it that doesn't need to constantly be expressed. It doesn't need to be told over and over again. It's simply how people live. And so those are two factors, but there are many. Obviously society itself incentivizes independence, incentivizes it, media, culture, entertainment, everything else. But those are a few. And, in some ways, if people are interested in marriage, a lot of times the question is, well, you're right. In some cases it is tragedy so far as people legitimately cannot find somebody, even as they're willing to make a fair number of compromises. And so those platforms are declining. And one of the things that's happened here is the rise of apps and the app culture, finding somebody. That can be extremely dehumanizing for people. Because now, Tinder, I guess there's like a Minder now and stuff like that. To a lot of people, it's like I'm shopping for a human being the same way I'm shopping for a product on Amazon, right? And that takes a toll on an individual. Because you're just being reduced to how you look and nothing else. And the type of conversations and exchanges that will materialize on those platforms can be extremely frustrating and depressing. And so you lack the context in which people can form healthy relationships, and the type of relationships that begin from a place of commitment, focused on commitment, right? And you have a society that provides you a lot of incentive and avenues for not pursuing marriage through their economic interests, through readily available hedonistic material and media and everything else. And so these are serious challenges. These are serious, serious challenges. And in some ways, they're more difficult to avoid with smartphones and everything else. And so that's something that people have to be attuned to, and certainly the type of thing that I think as Muslims we should speak out against. We have to have a moral voice in the society when these things are going on, and especially when they've burgeoned the way that they have. And Allah knows better.
Before we get into, mashallah, we got a lot of questions. Before we get into some of these few, because we're running out of time, we'll begin actually by, if it's okay, if you can give us a closing statement, 3-minute quick closing statement about some of the things that you think we can do to wrestle with these challenges. I remember when we were at the TMCC event, the first thing I mentioned was we should resist the temptation to say, what's the solution? Because there are no simple solutions, and these are multifaceted problems that need multifaceted solutions. But what are some of the things in maybe the essential categories, such as marriage, community, reinforcing family, and then maybe dealing with our children? What are some of the things that you have to suggest?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that I tend to suggest. And again, it's not comprehensive, but obviously a person placing more emphasis on their personal worship. One of the things that we have in decline, for instance, is something as simple as reading the Quran. Fewer people do it, and it's because it's something that requires patience. It's just an act of sabr, that you're sitting and you're doing this as an act of ibadah. Likewise, after prayer, tasbih, right? One of the things that I see often during the khutbah now, or after the khutbah, just prayer in general, is once salah ends, everyone's just on their phone, right? That's just, people just can't. The moments where a person is just sort of settled in remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are fewer. So a person should make sure to do those types of things, and certainly try to be more active in their worship. Sunnah, things like that, prayer. I oftentimes encourage fasting, because fasting is a discipline that people have to have. And I wrote about this recently, not just fasting as a regular ethic where a person's leaving food and drink, but fasting from different technologies, I think, is important. Fasting from social media, taking a day off, trying to minimize your use of your smartphone, especially in front of your family and kids, right? Being present in people's lives. I think that's important. I mentioned some of the things in the talk already that I encourage, just around being more attentive and caring for our elders, and having that sort of culture of elder care in our communities. At the end of the day, there are a lot of people that are hungry for community and for places of belonging in the real world. In the real world. And so we need to invest in places where people can build the bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood. And certainly this is something that I think is a task of the masjid, where we bring people, and all of those things happen here, where a person worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where a person receives moral instruction, where a person builds relationships with one another. And this isn't just about having fun, right? In fact, one of the things I find interesting, on a side note, is just how consumed people are with having fun, to the point where they don't know when the time for fun is over, right? Like, I see this in the transition in modern society with the culture around funerals. So more and more funerals are focused on celebrating people's lives. They become places to crack jokes and to get a laugh. And it's like that sort of solemn moment of just thinking about your own mortality is not something that many people can tolerate anymore. So this person, he'd want us just to be laughing and joking and celebrating next to his body when he passed away. That's what he would want. And it's such a strange thing for me to see. That, subhanAllah, death is supposed to be a stark reminder of our own mortality, of our standing in front of Allah. And yet those moments now in modern society are just like, it's just another place to joke. Like that's just what it is. And so, these are the types of things that our communities cannot lose. Because the draw and the pull on them is very strong. It's very strong to, the sort of draw to minimize family, to minimize the importance of marriage, to minimize the place of motherhood in modern society. There are huge campaigns now doing that. To reduce fatherhood and the respect that fathers should need to receive, necessarily have to receive. And this is for daughters and sons, that they need to have strong male role models and fathers in their lives. The importance on children, bearing children patiently, and having a community that cares about them. I mean, those are all things that's important for us, and that we have to push against the ease with which abandoning that happens. And it is very easy today to gain some social and cultural cachet by talking about how great independence is. And by talking about how all of these things are just, ossified, old school stereotypes of how people were supposed to live, and that as modern individuals, we can sort of embrace our own sort of realities in life and truths and all of that. I mean, that's not a life. That's not a life of Islam. It's just not a life of Islam. And it's something that we have to be on guard against, because today that's what's on offer everywhere you turn. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
Barakallahu feekum. So I'm just going to take a vote because I care about what you think. Raise your hand if you are okay with us going over to go through some of these questions. Okay, that's what I thought. Again, for those of you who need to leave, thank you for coming. I hope you've benefited from this. For those of you who are checking out mentally, no problem. Just make sure you're considerate again with the noise levels so that inshallah we can benefit from our beloved teacher. So I'm going to do a rapid fire.
Okay. I don't have a lot of time though. I actually have to head to the airport, so maybe like 5 minutes.
Yeah, 10 minutes inshallah. So here's a... Okay, we'll start with this. How has public policy affected the degradation of the family culture, and how should policy be changed to improve it?
Yeah, I mean that's a tough question. In some ways, public policy is responding to situations, and so they're enabling circumstances in which the family is more and more optional. So you can outsource more and more family life, and good politicians these days seem to provide more public services that minimize yet further the types of things that families have to do and that may be a little bit difficult for them, right? And so, if you're sort of a parent in the modern world and your child's in aftercare and daycare and, school all day, and, there's just always somewhere that you can offload them, then, you don't end up having a really meaningful relationship with them. And, there's a fair structure in place that seems to want to encourage that, because they recognize that when people can't do those things, they are not as economically viable as those that can. If you're in a 2-income household versus a 1-income household, there are consequences to that, to your lifestyle and to other things. And so there's a tremendous amount of encouragement around that. And the extent to which public policies can change, I don't know, because the society is structured already. The structure's already there. If anything, these trends are probably going to intensify, because they're already there through most of the world, certainly through most of Europe, and they tend to be ahead of us in a lot of these things anyways. And so, this seems to be the way that it's going. I mean, Allah knows best. I mean, anything can change. And we shouldn't foreclose on the possibility that things will change for the better. But I think from a policy perspective, at a minimum, we should take the type of policies that grate against some of the worst of these shifts, right? And so you have public policies now. The sort of emerging public policy position is the promotion of sex work and the legalization of sex work, right? Which is just another word for prostitution. And so these are things that we need to speak out against as moral actors, that this is a it's not an occupation, it's a dehumanizing place to put people in. That is not the type of life we want people to live. Commercial surrogacy. A person can basically just buy a child. And, this preys on low-income families and women that are living in low-income circumstances. Because what happens is they're the ones who basically go out, they get inseminated, they conceive of the child, and then the child goes off to the person who paid for that child. And some of them, that's the only way they can make ends meet, because it can be quite financially lucrative, right? And so these are the types of practices that are growing. There are a lot of policies that are being put in place to encourage that type of thing. And now there are celebrities who are entering children into their household through that means, that it's just a commercial surrogate that they paid a lot of money to. Now that's their child. This is the type of technological climate that a commercial society like ours enables. And I think at minimum, these are things that we need to have a moral voice against. And we should talk about the importance of the family, right? In family values, it's very much stigmatized, and partly because it's been co-opted by certain corners that can have problems in other domains and arenas, but so what, right? I mean, every cause is co-opted and doesn't have... substantively, we care about family, and we care about family values, and that should mean that we're willing to express those things in serious ways.
So forgive me, I wasn't attuned to your time. We'll take one more quick question. What we'll do is, inshallah, raise your hand if you'd like to see Imam Mobeen Vaid back here, inshallah. So I got a lot. MashaAllah, that makes me very happy. We're going to, hopefully we'll invite you back, and then we can address some of these things. Last question. All this sounds crazy. Shouldn't we just make hijrah? I mean, we're very privileged American Muslims. We have the money to make hijrah. We have the means to go into countries that, maybe support families more. And yet at the same time, they're maybe politically corrupt, and their structures are not politically conducive to freedoms we enjoy here. So, yeah, how do we kind of wrestle with this? Should we leave, or is there a way forward in staying to deal with some of these issues, especially seeing the almost inevitable kind of direction of what the value of Western life, what the values of Western life is starting to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I'll say that Western values are a global program, and so Muslim countries are not inoculated from this at all. And a lot of the trends I'm discussing are very much in place in majority Muslim societies. Some of them have crept into some societies more deeply than others, and they're more deeply entrenched in those places than they are than other places. I think that families have to make determinations as to where they want to live that is best for their iman, their belief, and their families. And if they can find a circumstance that's conducive to that, then they should pursue it. I think that for us here, we have to make an effort to formulate enclaves where we have individuals that share those common cause concerns, where we have overlapping commitments to these types of things. Because, so much of life for us is simply ordered around not only our immediate families, but our family relations and friendships and social activities. And you don't need many families to do something like that. You can form small groups, small collections that have those shared commitments and that share your values. And we can encourage our children to make friends within those settings. We can encourage the type of environment that we have more control over. Again, it's at a more local level that we're able to work. But that's something that I think that we should try to do more concertedly than we are today. Which means in some ways we're retreating a little bit from the public square. We're retreating in a way where we're focused on, this type of community that we want to be a part of in a more local space. Precisely because we cannot control national discourse. We can participate in it, but the chances are that we will be formed by it instead of forming it.
Exactly.
That's far more likely to happen. Yeah. And so, and that can happen anywhere. And so I think that is necessary. And, I haven't been throughout the entire world, and I'm sure that there are places that probably have very strong ethical foundations. But I think at the end of the day, Muslims have to make their subjective determinations. And, consult internally and think about what they believe is the best place to raise their children and to live a sustained existence, to transmit their faith, their belief, and their values generationally. That is the task at hand. And Allah knows best. Allah knows best.
One more round of applause for our brothers.